The widow stood on that dusty platform expecting salvation, a kind man to save her dying ranch. What stepped off that train was damnation itself. Jack Coulter wore his sins like that low-slung gun belt, and the sheriff's hand was already reaching for iron. Margaret Hale had written for a husband, but fate delivered an outlaw with a price on his head and ghosts in his eyes. By sundown, her choice would be made, and blood would soak the prairie before redemption could bloom. Stay with us until the end and comment what city you're watching from so we can see how far this story travels. The July sun hung like a brass coin over Copper Ridge, Nevada territory, beating down on the weathered planks of the train platform with the kind of merciless heat that made men contemplate their mortality and women question their choices. Margaret Hale stood rigid in her faded black mourning dress, 3 years worn now, the fabric thin at the elbows and bleached gray at the shoulders, where the sun had drunk the color like a thirsty man at a whiskey bottle. Her hands clutched a bundle of letters tied with string that had once been white but had yellowed with time and handling, the edges soft from being read and reread during long nights when sleep wouldn't come and the wind howled through the gaps in her ranch house walls. The train whistle screamed across the basin, and Margaret's heart lurched in her chest like a trapped bird. This was it. This was the moment that would decide whether the Hale Ranch lived or died, whether her son would have a future, or whether they'd be turned out onto the road like so many other widows and orphans the frontier had chewed up and spit out. Her hands trembled, and she pressed the letters harder against her ribs, feeling the edges dig into her skin through the thin cotton of her dress. "You sure about this, Maggie?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, the only woman in Copper Ridge who'd stood by her after Thomas died. Sarah ran the general store with her husband, and she was the one who'd suggested the mail-order husband in the first place, shown her the advertisements in the back of the Stockman's Journal. "No," Margaret answered honestly, her throat dry as alkali dust. "But being sure is a luxury I can't afford." Sarah squeezed her arm, and Margaret could feel the calluses on her friend's palm even through the fabric. These were frontier women. They knew about hard choices and harder consequences. They knew about doing what needed doing even when your stomach turned to water and your knees wanted to buckle. The locomotive was pulling in now, great clouds of steam billowing from beneath its iron wheels, the screech of metal on metal making conversation impossible. Margaret counted 3 passenger cars and knew her fate was sealed in one of them. Somewhere in that mechanical beast was a man named James Thornton. At least that was the name on the letters. He'd written of his ranch experience in Montana, his steady hands and steadier character. He'd written about wanting a fresh start after losing his own wife to cholera, about believing God put broken people together so they could help each other mend. The letters had been beautiful. Margaret had wept over them. But as the train shuddered to a halt and passengers began to disembark, she felt a cold finger of premonition trace her spine. Something wasn't right. The air itself seemed to thicken, to take on weight and texture, like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the world holds its breath. The first man down was a traveling salesman, his derby hat pulled low, sample case clutched to his chest. Then came a young couple, the woman pregnant and moving carefully, her husband's hand gentle at her elbow. A priest in dusty black, 2 miners with tools slung over their shoulders. A family with children who spilled onto the platform like water from a broken dam, their mother's voice sharp with exhaustion. And then he stepped down. Margaret's breath caught. This wasn't James Thornton. This couldn't be James Thornton. The man who descended from the train car moved like a predator, smooth, economical, his eyes scanning the platform and the town beyond with the systematic attention of someone who'd learned to spot trouble before it spotted him. He was tall, lean in the way of men who'd known hunger, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that hung loose at his sides, ready. His shirt was dusty, his hat pulled low, and on his right hip sat a Colt revolver in a gun belt that had been worn smooth with use, the leather supple and dark with oil and sweat. But it was his face that stopped her heart. Hard, angular, a jaw that looked carved from granite, and a mouth set in a line that spoke of pain endured and wisdom earned the brutal way. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against sun-darkened skin, and his eyes, God, his eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and troubled and seeing far too much. This was not a rancher looking for a fresh start. This was a man running from something, or running toward something worse. "Mrs. Hale?" His voice was rough, like boots on gravel, but there was something underneath it, an educated quality that didn't match the frontier roughness of his appearance. Margaret couldn't speak. Her tongue had turned to wood. "You are Margaret Hale, aren't you?" he asked again, and now she could see the uncertainty flicker across his face, quickly masked, but there nonetheless. "The woman who sent for... Where's James Thornton?" The words came out harsher than she intended, sharp with fear and disappointment. The stranger's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might lie, might try to pretend, but then his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and something that might have been shame crossed his features. "Dead," he said flatly. "Killed by a drunk cowboy in a saloon fight in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. I was there when it happened." He reached into his vest pocket, carefully, slowly, aware of how it looked for a man with a gun to make sudden movements, and pulled out a bundle of letters. Her letters. The ones she'd sent to James Thornton. "He asked me to deliver these to you. To explain. To tell you he was sorry." Margaret stared at the letters, at her own handwriting staring back at her like an accusation. The platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "That ain't all he asked, though, is it?" The new voice cut across the platform like a knife, and Margaret's blood turned to ice water. Sheriff Wade Garrett stood 20 feet away, his hand resting on the butt of his own pistol, his deputy flanking him with a shotgun cradled in his arms. Wade was 50 if he was a day, with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that had seen too much of the worst humanity had to offer. He was a good sheriff, fair and hard, and right now he was looking at the stranger the way a man looks at a rattlesnake in his bedroll. "Wade," Margaret started, but the sheriff cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from that man." "Sheriff, I don't know what—" "His name ain't James Thornton," Wade said, his voice carrying across the platform, drawing attention. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The town was watching now, and Margaret felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical thing. "His name's Jack Coulter, and he's wanted for bank robbery and murder in 3 territories. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward. Jack Coulter. Margaret had heard that name. Everyone had heard that name. The man who'd ridden with the Dalton gang before they turned on each other. The man who'd supposedly killed 2 lawmen in Colorado and a bank teller in Wyoming. The man with a price on his head that would set a poor widow up for life. "Is that true?" Margaret heard herself ask, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. "Are you Jack Coulter?" He didn't look away from the sheriff, didn't break eye contact with the man who could end his life with a twitch of his finger. But his voice, when he spoke, was directed at her. "Yes, ma'am, I am." "And the rest of it? The robbery? The killing?" Now he did look at her, and the pain in his eyes was so naked, so raw, that she took an involuntary step backward. "The name's real enough. The rest is a damn lie, but I don't expect you to believe that. Nobody else has." "Step away from the lady, Coulter," Wade ordered, his gun clearing leather with a smooth, practiced motion. "Get your hands where I can see them." "Wade, wait." Margaret didn't know why she was speaking up, didn't understand the impulse that made her step between the sheriff and this stranger, this wanted man. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the same instinct that had made her marry Thomas Hale when she was 17 and follow him into this brutal country. The same stubborn, self-destructive refusal to accept the easy answer, the safe path. "This man came here under false pretenses," she said, her voice gaining strength even as her knees threatened to give out. "He came to fulfill an obligation made by a dead man. That's not a crime, Wade." "He's wanted for robbery and murder, Maggie," the sheriff said, and there was genuine concern in his voice now, the kind that came from knowing someone for years, from watching them struggle and survive. "That makes everything else irrelevant." "Then arrest him," Margaret shot back. "But not before he's had a chance to explain himself, not before I've heard his story. James Thornton asked him to come here, asked him to deliver those letters. That man's dying wish brought Jack Coulter to Copper Ridge, and I'll be damned if I'll let you gun him down on my account before I know why." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Wade's face worked through a series of emotions: frustration, concern, anger, something that might have been grudging respect. Finally, he lowered his gun, though he didn't holster it. "You've got until sundown," he said to Jack Coulter. You talk to Mrs. Hale, you tell her whatever story you've concocted, and then you get on a horse and ride out of my town. If you're still here when the sun touches the ridge, I'll bring you in. Understood?" Jack's throat worked as he swallowed. "Understood, Sheriff. And thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank her. She just bought you your life, though God knows why." Wade turned to Margaret, and his expression softened. "Maggie, you sure about this? You don't owe this man anything." "Maybe not," she agreed, "but James Thornton's memory deserves better than a shootout on a train platform. Give me this afternoon, Wade. That's all I'm asking." The sheriff held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply. "Sundown, Maggie. Not a minute later." He jerked his head at his deputy, and they withdrew, but not far. They took up position outside the sheriff's office, watching, waiting. The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing like angry hornets. Margaret could feel their judgment, their speculation. By nightfall, the whole county would know that the widow Hale had taken up with a wanted outlaw. Her reputation, already tattered by 3 years of stubborn independence, would be in shreds. She turned to Jack Coulter, the stranger who'd just blown her life apart, and saw him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with suspicion, mixed with something that might have been hope. "Why?" he asked simply. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe because I'm tired of men deciding what I can and can't do. Maybe because you look like you've got a story that deserves telling, or maybe I'm just a fool." She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. "My ranch is 3 miles south. You can tell me your story there, away from prying eyes. After that, you can ride out like Wade said, and I'll figure out what to do about my dying ranch and my son and the winter that's coming, whether I'm ready or not." "You have a son?" Something flickered in his expression. "Daniel, he's 7. He's at the ranch with my hired hand, such as he is. Old Pete's 70 if he's a day, and he can barely lift a hay bale anymore." Jack picked up the carpet bag that sat at his feet. His only luggage, she noted, and gestured toward the horses tied at the hitching post. "That your wagon?" "It is." "Then let's go, Mrs. Hale. We're burning daylight, and I've got a lot of explaining to do." The ride out to the ranch was conducted in silence. Margaret drove the wagon, her hands steady on the reins despite the turmoil in her chest, while Jack sat beside her, his carpetbag at his feet and his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She noticed he sat on the side away from his gun hand, noticed the way he positioned himself to see both forward and back. This was a man who'd learned to expect trouble from every direction. The land rolled out around them in shades of brown and gold, the grass sun-bleached and sparse, the few trees twisted by wind and drought into tortured shapes. In the distance, the Sierra Nevadas rose like broken teeth against the sky, snow-capped even in July, beautiful and brutal and indifferent to the struggles of the people trying to scratch out a living at their feet. Margaret had loved this land once. When Thomas had first brought her here, young and full of dreams, she'd thought it was the most beautiful place on earth. Now she knew better. This land didn't care about love or dreams. It took what it wanted and gave back only what you could force from it through sweat and blood and sheer stubborn will. And lately, it had been taking more than she could afford to give. "How bad is it?" Jack's voice startled her from her thoughts. "What?" "The ranch. You said it's dying. How bad?" She considered lying, considered pride, then dismissed both. What did she have to lose now? "Bad. We lost half the herd last winter to the cold. The well's running dry. The south pasture fence is down, and I can't afford the lumber to fix it. Pete does what he can, but he's old and his back's gone. I've been trying to hold it together for Daniel, but..." She trailed off, the words catching in her throat. "Another winter like the last one, and we'll lose everything." "That's why you sent for a husband." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "I sent for help. The husband part was just the price of admission. No man's going to work a failing ranch for wages I can't pay, but a husband has a stake in survival. Or so I thought." Jack was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "James Thornton," he said finally, "the man whose letters you have. He was a good man, Mrs. Hale, one of the best I've known. He talked about you sometimes after the first letter came. Said you wrote like someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. He admired that." "But he's dead." "He's dead," Jack confirmed. Cowboy named Riley got drunk, decided James had looked at him wrong, put a bullet through his heart before anyone could stop him. James died in my arms on the floor of a saloon in Cheyenne, bleeding out while the piano player kept playing and the barkeep kept pouring drinks like a man's life ending was just another Tuesday. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Margaret glanced at him and saw his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "He asked you to bring me the letters," she said. "Why would he do that? Why would a dying man care about the correspondence of a woman he'd never met?" "Because he knew what it was like to need hope," Jack said quietly. "And he knew what it was like to have it taken away. He didn't want that for you. He made me promise I'd bring them to you, explain what happened, tell you he was sorry he couldn't keep his word. You could have just mailed them." "I could have. But you came yourself. Walked right into a town where the sheriff knows your face and your name, where you knew you'd be recognized. Why?" Jack turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. Those winter storm eyes held depths she couldn't begin to fathom, pain and regret, and something that might have been longing. "Because I made a promise to a dying man," he said, "and because—" He stopped, seemed to wrestle with something internal. "Because I've been running for 3 years, Mrs. Hale. Running from sheriffs and bounty hunters and the memory of what I lost. And I'm tired. I'm so goddamn tired of running. When James told me about you, about this place, about a woman trying to save her dead husband's dream for her son, it sounded like something worth stopping for. Even if it was just for an afternoon, even if it cost me everything." The ranch house came into view then, and Margaret felt her heart sink as she saw it through a stranger's eyes. The paint was peeling, the porch sagging on one side where the support beam had rotted through. The barn looked even worse, its roof patched with mismatched boards and the doors hanging crooked on their hinges. This was what she was trying to save, this collection of weathered wood and failing dreams. But then Daniel came running out of the house, 7 years old and all knees and elbows, his hair dark like his father's had been, and Margaret's resolve hardened. She wasn't trying to save buildings. She was trying to save her son's future. That was worth any price, any humiliation. "Ma!" Daniel shouted, waving frantically. "Old Pete said you were bringing someone. Is that the new man? The one who's going to help fix things?" Margaret pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride. Before she could answer, Jack had dismounted as well, and she saw him looking at Daniel with an expression that made her chest ache, hunger and loss and something almost like fear. "Daniel, this is Mr. Coulter," she said carefully. He brought me some letters from a friend. He'll be staying for supper, but then he has to leave." "Leave?" Daniel's face fell. "But Pete said—" "Pete was mistaken," Margaret cut him off gently. "Mr. Coulter has business elsewhere. Now go help him with the horses while I get supper started." Daniel's disappointment was palpable, but he was a ranch kid. He knew how to follow orders. He moved toward the horses with the unconscious competence of a child who'd grown up around animals, and Jack followed, murmuring something to the boy that made Daniel's face light up. Margaret watched them for a moment, then turned to find old Pete standing on the porch, leaning heavily on his cane. Pete had worked for Thomas since before she'd arrived, had been at the ranch longer than anyone. His face was a map of wrinkles, his back bent from decades of hard labor, but his eyes were still sharp. "That the man you sent for?" he asked. "It's complicated, Pete." "It's always complicated with you, Maggie girl." He shook his head. "But I know trouble when I see it, and that man's carrying a full load. You sure about this?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." She went inside to start supper, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind raced. What was she doing? What had she been thinking, bringing a wanted man to her home, around her son? Wade had given her until sundown, but that was only a few hours away. What did she hope to accomplish in that time? The truth was, she didn't know. All she knew was that when she'd looked into Jack Coulter's eyes on that train platform, she'd seen something she recognized. The desperation of someone trying to outrun their past. The exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting for so long they'd forgotten what peace felt like. She knew that feeling. She lived that feeling every single day. Outside, she could hear Daniel chattering away at Jack, asking 1,000 questions the way 7-year-olds did. She couldn't hear Jack's responses, but she heard the low rumble of his voice, patient and calm. A man who was good with children. A man who seemed gentle despite the gun on his hip and the price on his head. Or maybe she was just a fool, seeing what she wanted to see because she was desperate and alone and so tired of carrying the weight of this ranch, this life, this endless struggle by herself. The sun was dropping toward the western ridge when they all sat down to supper. Salt pork and beans and cornbread, simple food, but filling. Daniel dominated the conversation, telling Jack about the ranch, about the cattle, about his plans to be the best rancher in Nevada when he grew up. Jack listened, asked questions, seemed genuinely interested. And all the while, Margaret watched him, trying to reconcile the wanted outlaw with the man sitting at her table, carefully wiping his mouth with his napkin and complimenting her cooking. Finally, when Pete had taken Daniel out to do the evening chores, leaving them alone, Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Jack. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me the truth. All of it." Jack wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, his scarred knuckles white with tension. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stared into the dark liquid like he might find answers there. Then he began to talk. "My brother's name was Samuel," Jack began, his voice low and rough, like he was dragging the words up from somewhere deep and painful. "Sam Coulter. He was 2 years younger than me, and he was the good one, the smart one. While I was breaking horses and getting into fights, Sam was reading law books by candlelight, talking about justice and making the world better. He believed in things, you know. He believed people were fundamentally decent, that the law mattered, that right would prevail over wrong if good men stood up." Margaret said nothing, just watched him over the rim of her coffee cup, waiting. "We grew up in Missouri, farm country. Pa died when I was 15, Sam was 13. Ma followed him 6 months later, just gave up, I think. Couldn't face another winter alone. So it was just us, 2 boys trying to work a farm we didn't know how to run, trying to be men when we were still children." Jack's jaw worked, a muscle jumping beneath the sun-darkened skin. "We lost the farm, bank foreclosed. We were out on the road with nothing but the clothes on our backs and our father's rifle." He took a sip of coffee, grimaced like it burned going down. Outside, the sky was turning gold and orange, the sun sliding toward the ridgeline. Time was running out. "I took work where I could find it. Ranch hand, buffalo hunter, whatever paid. Sam, he kept reading those law books. Carried them in a saddlebag everywhere we went. When we hit Deadwood in '76, he was 18 and I was 20, and he got himself apprenticed to a lawyer there. Judge Harlan Matthews, old man with more principles than sense. Sam worked for him for 3 years, learning the law, taking cases for people who couldn't afford representation. He was good at it, really good." "What happened?" Margaret asked quietly. Jack's face hardened, his eyes going distant. "There was a bank in Deadwood, First National. The manager was a man named Cornelius Blake, fat, greasy son of a bitch who'd foreclosed on half the homesteads in Lawrence County. Sam was representing a widow, trying to prove Blake had manipulated the interest rates on her loan, that the foreclosure was fraudulent. He had evidence, documents showing Blake and his partners had been running a scheme for years, stealing land from people who couldn't fight back. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She knew where this was going. The night before the hearing, someone broke into Judge Matthews' office, beat Sam half to death, stole all his files, all his evidence, left him bleeding on the floor with a fractured skull and 3 broken ribs. Jack's hands tightened around the coffee cup until Margaret thought it might shatter. "I found him the next morning. He lived for 2 days, never regained consciousness, died without knowing whether his widow would get justice." I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "Blake left town that same night," Jack continued, his voice flat now, emotionless, like he was reciting facts from a newspaper. "Him and 2 of his associates, James Worth and Porter Daniels. They cleaned out the bank's safe, took nearly $30,000, and disappeared. The law said it was a robbery, said Sam must have interrupted them, that's why they killed him. But I knew better. It wasn't a robbery, it was murder to cover up fraud, and they took the money to make it look like something else." He set down his cup carefully, precisely, like he was afraid of what he might do if his hands weren't occupied. "I went after them. Tracked them to Cheyenne, then to Denver, then to Santa Fe. It took me 6 months, but I found them in a mining town called Silver Creek, Colorado. They were living high, spending that stolen money like water, and nobody knew who they really were. I walked into the saloon where they were drinking and I called them out, called Blake a murderer and a thief in front of the whole town. What did they do? Margaret leaned forward despite herself, caught in the story. Blake went for his gun. So did Worth. I was faster. Jack's voice was completely devoid of inflection now, and somehow that made it worse. I killed them both, clean shots, dead before they hit the floor. Daniels ran and I let him go. He'd just been a clerk, hadn't been part of the actual killing. But someone in that saloon recognized Blake's name from a wanted poster. And before I could explain, before I could tell them who he was and what he'd done, the local sheriff had me in irons. Margaret's breath caught. They arrested you for the robbery? Daniels told them I was Blake's partner, that I'd turned on him for the money, said I'd killed Sam myself, that the three of us had robbed the bank together, and I'd double-crossed them. It was a good story, better than the truth anyway. More believable. And I had no evidence to contradict it. All Sam's files were gone, burned or destroyed. Judge Matthews had died of a stroke 2 months after Sam. There was nobody left who knew the real story. But surely someone, who, Mrs. Hale? Who was going to believe a drifter with 2 fresh corpses to his name over a banker's associate with a suit and a story? The law doesn't care about truth, it cares about what can be proven, and I couldn't prove a damn thing. Bitterness dripped from every word. They tried me for robbery and murder. I was convicted in 3 hours. Judge sentenced me to hang. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. How did you escape? I didn't. Not from the courthouse, anyway. They transferred me to the territorial prison in Cannon City to await execution. I was there for 4 months before I got my chance. There was a fire in the kitchen, spread to the main cell block. In the chaos, 3 of us got out. The other 2 were real criminals, men who'd actually done what they were accused of. They went one way, I went another. I've been running ever since. The sun was touching the ridge now, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Shadows stretched long across the yard, and in the distance, Margaret could hear Daniel laughing at something Pete had said. The sound was jarring, innocent, and pure against the darkness of Jack's tale. That was 3 years ago, Jack continued. 3 years of looking over my shoulder, of sleeping with one eye open, of never staying anywhere long enough to make a friend or have a life. I've worked ranches under false names, mines where nobody asked questions, logging camps in the mountains. Everywhere I go, I see my face on wanted posters. Every lawman in 3 territories knows my name. But you stopped, Margaret said. You stopped running to bring me those letters. Why? Jack looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes held such weariness that she felt it in her bones. Because I met James Thornton in Cheyenne, and for 2 weeks I had a friend. Someone who didn't know my name or my story, who just saw me as another cowboy passing through. We played cards, shared meals, talked about everything and nothing. And when your first letter arrived at the general delivery, he showed it to me. Read parts of it out loud, laughing about this widow in Nevada who wrote like a school teacher and thought like a rancher. Margaret felt her cheeks heat. He laughed at my letters? Not meanly, Jack assured her. He was charmed. Said you reminded him of his late wife, sharp and strong and honest. He wrote you back that same night, and I watched him labor over every word, wanting to get it right. He was falling in love with you through those letters, Mrs. Hale. Or at least falling in love with the idea of you. Of a fresh start. Of being needed again. The ache in Margaret's chest was almost unbearable. To know that somewhere, someone had been falling in love with her words while she'd been falling for his. And now he was dead, and she'd never even seen his face. When the cowboys shot him, Jack said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, James grabbed my hand. His last words were about you. He said, "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her she deserves better than broken promises." He made me swear I'd bring you those letters, explain what happened, and then he said something else, something that's haunted me ever since. What? Margaret asked, barely breathing. He said, maybe you should stay there. Maybe that's where you're supposed to stop running. And then he died. Silence fell between them, heavy and profound. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind the ridge, and the sky was fading from gold to purple to deep blue. Sundown. Wade's deadline had arrived. I don't know if James was delirious or prophetic, Jack said, standing slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. But I've thought about those words every mile between Cheyenne and here. About what it would mean to stop running, to stand and fight, to maybe, just maybe, find a place where I could be something other than a wanted man. He picked up his hat from the table, turned it in his hands. But that's not fair to you or your boy. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. The sheriff will be coming soon, and when he does, I'll go peacefully. I'll ride out and you'll never see me again. You'll find another way to save your ranch, and your son will grow up without the stain of knowing his mother harbored a fugitive. Margaret stood as well, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Everything in her rational mind screamed at her to let him go, to thank whatever providence had kept the sheriff at bay this long and to send Jack Coulter riding into the sunset where he belonged. She had a son to protect, a reputation to maintain, a ranch to save through legitimate means. But when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "The south fence is down," she said. 100 yards of it, maybe more. The posts are rotted through and the wires rusted. I need it fixed before the cattle drift onto Henderson's land, because he'll impound them and charge me fees I can't afford. Pete's back won't let him do the work, and I can't do it alone. It's a 3-day job, maybe 4. Jack stared at her like she'd started speaking Chinese. "Mrs. Hale, the well's running dry," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "There's water down there, I know it, but the well needs to be dug deeper. That's another week's work, hard labor with a pick and shovel. And the barn roof needs patching before the autumn rains come, and the house needs a new support beam on the porch. And there are 1,000 other things that need doing if this ranch is going to survive the winter." "What are you saying?" Margaret took a deep breath, committing to a course of action that might be the bravest or most foolish thing she'd ever done. "I'm saying that Wade gave you until sundown to ride out. And the sun's down now, but you're still here. And if you're willing to stay, if you're willing to work instead of run, then maybe James Thornton was right. Maybe this is where you're supposed to stop. The sheriff? Wade's a good man, but he's also a practical one. You're wanted in Colorado and Wyoming and Montana, not here in Nevada. If you keep your head down, if you work the ranch and don't cause trouble, he might be willing to let sleeping dogs lie. At least for a while. At least until you've had a chance to prove you're not the man those wanted posters say you are." Jack shook his head slowly, but she could see the hunger in his eyes, the desperate want to believe what she was offering. "You don't know what you're asking. If they find me here, if bounty hunters come, or federal marshals, then we'll deal with it," Margaret said firmly. "Together. You want to prove you're not a criminal? Then prove it. Stay here. Work this ranch. Help me save what my husband built. And maybe, just maybe, we can both find a way to outrun our pasts." The door burst open before Jack could respond, and Daniel came tumbling in, Pete limping behind him. The boy's eyes were bright with excitement. "Ma, the sheriff's coming. We saw his horse from the barn. Is he coming to arrest Mr. Coulter? Are there going to be guns? Can I watch?" Margaret's heart lurched. She looked past Daniel to see Wade Garrett riding into the yard, his badge catching the last light of dusk. Behind him rode his deputy, and behind them, Margaret's blood ran cold, were 3 men she didn't recognize. Rough men, with hard faces and guns prominently displayed. Bounty hunters. "Pete?" she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Take Daniel to his room. Now." "But, Ma, now, Daniel." Pete must have heard something in her tone because he grabbed Daniel's shoulder and steered him toward the back of the house despite the boy's protests. Margaret heard the door close, and then it was just her and Jack facing the men outside. "I'll go," Jack said, his hand moving toward his gun. "No point in making this worse." "Stop." Margaret grabbed his arm, felt the tension in his muscles. "Just wait. Let me talk to Wade first." She stepped out onto the porch before Jack could argue, smoothing down her dress and lifting her chin. Wade had dismounted, and the 3 bounty hunters were spreading out, flanking him. Professional. Dangerous. "Evening, Maggie," Wade said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "I gave you until sundown." "And I appreciate the courtesy, Wade," she replied evenly. Mr. Coulter and I were just discussing his departure. That's so. One of the bounty hunters stepped forward, a tall man with a scarred face and cruel eyes. Because it looks to me like he's making himself right comfortable. Word is, you even fed him supper. I wasn't aware that hospitality was a crime, Mr. Garrett Vance, the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And we're not here about your hospitality, ma'am. We're here for Jack Coulter, who's worth $2,000 to us. Dead or alive, the poster says, though dead's easier to transport. Margaret felt ice water flood her veins, but she kept her expression neutral. Sheriff, you're not seriously going to let these men take a prisoner without due process? Wade's face was troubled. Maggie, he's a wanted fugitive. These men have a legal right to murder him without trial? Her voice rose despite her best efforts to remain calm. Is that what passes for justice in Copper Ridge now? Now hold on, Wade started, but Garrett Vance cut him off. The law says dead or alive, widow. We prefer dead. Less trouble, less chance he'll escape again. I'm sure you understand. Jack appeared in the doorway then, and Margaret heard the collective sound of hammers being cocked. 4 guns trained on him in an instant. There's no need for this, Jack said, his hands held carefully away from his sides. I'll come peacefully. No reason for anyone to get hurt. Jack, no, Margaret started, but Vance was already moving forward, his gun leveled at Jack's chest. On your knees, Coulter, hands behind your head. For a moment, Margaret thought Jack would comply. She saw him start to lower himself, saw the resignation in his eyes. And then everything happened at once. A rider burst into the yard from the direction of town, his horse lathered and blowing hard. It was Tommy Chen, Sarah's 16-year-old son, and his face was pale with urgency. Sheriff! Sheriff Garrett! He shouted, hauling his horse to a sliding stop. You gotta come quick. There's been a robbery at the bank. 3 men with guns. They've got hostages. Wade's head snapped around. What? When? Just now, maybe 10 minutes ago. Ma sent me to fetch you. They're saying they'll start shooting people if you don't come. The sheriff's face went white, then red. He turned to his deputy. Get the horses, now. Then to the bounty hunters. You men, you're deputized. We've got a situation in town. Garrett Vance didn't lower his gun. Our business is here, Sheriff. The bank can wait. The hell it can. Wade's voice cracked like a whip. There are civilians in danger. That takes precedence over your bounty. You want to operate in my territory? You follow my orders. Now mount up. For a tense moment, Vance didn't move. Then slowly, he holstered his weapon. This ain't over, Coulter. When we get back, you're still ours. If we get back, one of the other bounty hunters muttered, bank robbers don't usually leave witnesses. Wade swung into his saddle, his face grim. He looked down at Margaret, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a warning. Keep him here, Maggie. When this is done, we're going to have a serious conversation about harboring fugitives. When this is done, Wade, we're going to have a serious conversation about a lot of things, she shot back. The sheriff nodded once, then spurred his horse. The bounty hunters followed, albeit reluctantly, and in moments the thunder of hoofbeats was fading into the distance, leaving Margaret and Jack alone in the gathering darkness. Jack let out a breath he'd been holding. That was close. Too close. Margaret's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with her. You need to go, now, before they come back. No. She spun to face him. What do you mean, no? Jack, they're going to kill you. Did you not hear that man? Dead or alive, and he prefers dead. I heard him. Jack stepped down from the porch, moved to the barn. Which is why I'm not running, not anymore. Have you lost your mind? Maybe. He was pulling tools from the barn now, a post hole digger, wire cutters, work gloves. Or maybe I finally found it. You said the south fence is down. Let's go fix it. Margaret stared at him like he'd sprouted a second head. It's dark. There's a bank robbery in town. Bounty hunters will be back as soon as they're done. And you want to fix a fence? I want to do something that matters, Jack said, turning to face her. The moonlight caught his features, throwing them into sharp relief, the hard planes of his face, the determination in his eyes. I've spent 3 years running, Mrs. Hale. 3 years accomplishing nothing, changing nothing, being nothing but a ghost with a price on his head. You offered me a chance to stop, to work, to maybe be something other than what those posters say I am. So that's what I'm going to do. They'll kill you. Probably. He hefted the post hole digger onto his shoulder. But I'd rather die fixing your fence than spend another day running. At least this way, I'll have done something decent. Something Sam would have been proud of. Margaret's throat tightened. This was insanity. This was suicide. This was the most foolishly noble thing she'd ever witnessed. You're an idiot, Jack Coulter. Yes, ma'am. Probably so. He started walking toward the south pasture, his stride long and purposeful. You coming or not? She should go inside. She should take Daniel and Pete and ride to town, report everything to Wade when he returned. She should protect herself, protect her son, protect the life she'd built. Instead, she grabbed a lantern from the porch and followed Jack into the darkness. They worked through the night, the lantern casting a small pool of light in the vast darkness of the prairie. Jack dug post holes while Margaret cleared away the rotted wood and tangled wire of the old fence. It was hard, brutal labor, the kind that left your hands bleeding and your back screaming, but there was something almost meditative about it. The rhythm of the work, the simple physicality of it, seemed to quiet something in both of them. Tell me about your husband, Jack said after an hour of silence. He was waist-deep in a post hole, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool night air. Margaret paused in her work, surprised by the question. Thomas? You loved him? She considered the question, really considered it. I married him when I was 17. He was 25, established, solid. My father approved. It seemed like the right thing to do. She pulled another tangle of wire free, careful of the rusty barbs. I suppose I loved him, in my way. He was good to me. Patient with my moods, proud of my strength. He built this ranch with his own 2 hands, wanted to create something that would last. But he was gone more than he was here. Always chasing the next opportunity, the next deal. He died in a hotel in Sacramento, negotiating for cattle he'd already borrowed against. Left me with debts and a dream and a son who barely remembers him. Jack climbed out of the hole, wiped his face with his sleeve. I'm sorry. Don't be. Thomas gave me Daniel and this place. He gave me something to fight for, even if he couldn't stay to fight beside me. She met Jack's eyes across the lantern light. What about you? Was there ever anyone? Once, his voice went soft. Her name was Emily. She was the daughter of the rancher I worked for in Montana before everything went to hell. We were going to be married, had it all planned. Sam was going to perform the ceremony. He'd just gotten licensed by Judge Matthews. We were going to buy land together, build something that mattered. What happened? I got arrested. She waited for 3 months, wrote me letters. Then her father made her see reason, told her I was a criminal, that I'd bring nothing but shame to their family. She married a banker's son 6 months later. I got the announcement in prison right before the fire. The pain in his voice was so raw that Margaret had to look away. They went back to work, but something had shifted between them. Some wall had come down, some barrier of propriety and distance. They were just 2 people now, scarred by loss and hardened by disappointment, finding unexpected comfort in shared labor under the stars. By dawn, they'd replaced 15 fence posts and strung new wire across a third of the damaged section. Margaret's hands were blistered, her dress filthy, her hair falling loose from its pins. Jack looked no better. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, his hands bleeding from a dozen wire cuts, exhaustion written in every line of his face, but the fence was standing. Part of it, anyway. We should get back to the house, Margaret said as the sky began to lighten in the east. Pete will be worried, and Daniel will have 100 questions, Jack finished with a tired smile. Does he always talk that much? You have no idea. Wait until he really gets comfortable with you. She froze, realizing what she'd said. I mean, if you're still here, which you won't be, which you shouldn't be. But Jack was looking toward the house, where smoke was rising from the chimney. Pete had started breakfast. It looked domestic, peaceful, like something from a life Jack Coulter would never have. I could finish the fence today, he said quietly. Have it done by nightfall if I push hard. Then I'll go. No arguments. But let me do this one thing first. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to remind him about the bounty hunters and Wade's warning, But she was too tired, and her rational objection seemed pale and weak in the dawn light. All right, today. But tonight, you ride. They trudged back to the house to find Pete on the porch, his weathered face creased with worry. You two are damn fools, he said without preamble, working all night while killers are looking for you. The fence needed fixing, Margaret said simply. The fence can wait, your lives can't. Pete shook his head. But I suppose arguing with either of you is like arguing with the weather. Come on, I made breakfast. You'll want to eat before the sheriff gets back. But Wade didn't return that morning, nor that afternoon. The sun climbed high and hot, and still there was no word from town. Margaret tried not to worry, tried to focus on her own work while Jack labored on the fence, but unease sat heavy in her stomach. It was Daniel who finally brought news, riding back from where Margaret had sent him to fetch supplies from the Chen store. His face was flushed with excitement as he pulled his pony to a stop. Ma, Mr. Jack, the bank robbers got away, shot Deputy Miller in the leg and rode out before the sheriff could stop them. They're saying it was the worst robbery in Nevada history. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Is the deputy all right? Doc says he'll live, but his leg's in bad shape, and Ma... Daniel's voice dropped conspiratorially. Mrs. Chen says one of the robbers looked just like the man on the wanted poster in the sheriff's office, the one that says Jack Coulter on it. The world seemed to tilt. Margaret looked at Jack, who had frozen mid-swing with the hammer, his face gone pale. That's impossible, she said. Jack was here. He was with me all night. We were fixing the fence. Daniel's eyes went wide. Does that mean Mr. Jack's not the robber? Does that mean he can stay? From the road came the sound of approaching horses. Multiple horses, moving fast. Margaret's heart began to pound as she recognized Wade Garrett's big bay gelding, the sheriff bent low over its neck, riding hard. But he wasn't alone. Behind him rode what looked like half the town, merchants and ranchers, women and children, all mounted and armed and looking like they meant business. And at the front of the group, her face set in determined lines, was Sarah Chen. Wade pulled up in the yard, his horse dancing and blowing. His face was haggard, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but when he looked at Jack, something like hope flickered in his expression. Jack Coulter, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. I need you to tell me where you were last night between the hours of 8 p.m. and midnight. Jack set down the hammer slowly, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. Margaret could see his mind working, calculating, trying to understand what this meant. The crowd behind Wade had gone silent, waiting, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I was here, Jack said finally, his voice steady, despite the tremor Margaret could see in his hands. I was fixing Mrs. Hale's south fence from sundown until just before dawn. Can anyone verify that? Wade's tone was carefully neutral, but Margaret could hear something underneath it, something that sounded almost like desperation. I can. Margaret stepped forward before she could second-guess herself. Jack was with me the entire night. We worked on the fence together. He didn't leave this property, not for a single moment. A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret could see faces she recognized. John Henderson, whose land bordered hers to the south. Mary Patterson from the church. Tom Wu, who ran the feed store. They were watching her with expressions that ranged from shock to disapproval to something that might have been pity. Sarah Chen pushed her horse forward, and Margaret had never been more grateful to see her friend's determined face. I can confirm part of it, Wade. I rode out here around midnight to warn Maggie about those bounty hunters coming back. I saw them both working on the fence, saw the lantern light from half a mile away. They were exactly where they say they were. Wade's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. Then we've got a problem, or rather, we've got proof of something I've been suspecting for 3 years. What are you talking about, Sheriff? Garrett Vance pushed his horse through the crowd, his face dark with anger. The other 2 bounty hunters flanked him, and all 3 looked like they'd been rode hard and put away wet. Coulter's wanted for bank robbery. There was just a bank robbery. Seems pretty cut and dried to me. Except the man who robbed our bank last night looked exactly like Jack Coulter, Wade said, turning to face the bounty hunter. Same height, same build, even wearing similar clothes. One of the hostages said she'd swear on a stack of Bibles it was him, Except it couldn't have been, because Jack Coulter was 3 miles outside of town fixing a fence with 2 witnesses to prove it. The crowd erupted into confused chatter. Margaret felt Jack tense beside her, felt the coiled energy in him like a spring wound too tight. "That's ridiculous," Vance spat. "The widow's lying. She's protecting him." "I ain't lying." Old Pete's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He stood on the porch, leaning heavily on his cane, but his eyes were sharp and angry. "I was awake most of the night with my bad back. Saw them both working until my eyes got too tired to keep watching. Nobody left this property, and nobody came onto it except Mrs. Chen around midnight, just like she said." "3 witnesses," Wade said, and now there was steel in his voice. 3 people with no reason to lie, all saying the same thing. Jack Coulter was here when that bank was robbed, which means someone else is using his name and his face to commit crimes. "Or they're all in on it together," Vance argued, but his conviction was wavering. Margaret could see it in his eyes, the uncomfortable realization that his easy payday was slipping away. "Think about it," Jack said, and his voice was loud enough to carry across the whole yard. 3 years ago, I was convicted of robbing a bank in Colorado, a bank that was supposedly robbed by 3 men, Cornelius Blake, James Worth, and Porter Daniels. I killed Blake and Worth, and Daniels testified against me. But what if Daniels wasn't just a clerk? What if he was the one who actually committed the robbery, and he framed me to cover his tracks? Margaret's mind was racing, pieces clicking together. "If Daniels looked enough like you, he was my height, my build, same coloring," Jack confirmed. "Sam used to joke that Daniels and I could have been brothers if you saw us from a distance. What if he's been using my name and my reputation to rob banks? Every crime gets attributed to Jack Coulter, the notorious outlaw, while Porter Daniels walks free." "That's a hell of a theory," Wade said slowly, "but it's just a theory without proof." "I can give you proof." The voice came from the back of the crowd, reedy and uncertain. A man pushed forward on a sway-backed mare, elderly, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Margaret recognized him as Thaddeus Moore, who ran the town's small newspaper. "I've been tracking bank robberies across the territories for a story I'm writing. In the past 3 years, there have been 7 banks robbed by men matching Jack Coulter's description. 7 banks in 5 territories, and every time, witnesses describe the same man, tall, dark-haired, wearing a gun belt low on his right hip." "That describes half the men in the West," Vance interjected. "True," Moore agreed. "But here's what's interesting. I started mapping the robberies, tracking the dates and locations. The first one was in Silver Creek, Colorado, the night after Jack Coulter escaped from prison. But the others show a pattern. They move steadily south and west, following the mining towns and cattle centers. And in every single case, the robber worked alone or with one other man, never the 3 that the original Colorado robbery supposedly involved." Wade was listening intently now, his lawman's mind working. "You're saying it's the same man committing all these robberies?" "I'm saying it's possible. And I'm saying that if Jack Coulter was in prison during the first robbery, and we know for certain he was here during this one, then maybe, just maybe, he's not the man we've been looking for." Margaret felt hope surge in her chest, fierce and almost painful. Could this be real? Could Jack actually be innocent of everything except defending his brother's memory? "This is horseshit," Vance growled. He turned to Wade, his hand dropping to his gun. "That man's worth $2,000, and I aim to collect. You want to stand in my way, Sheriff?" The crowd shifted nervously. Margaret saw Wade's deputy, his leg bandaged but his shotgun steady, move to flank the sheriff. The air crackled with the potential for violence. "I want to do my job," Wade said quietly, but there was iron underneath the words. "Which means I investigate crimes instead of just collecting bounties. Jack Coulter stays here, under my supervision, until we can sort this out properly. Anyone who's got a problem with that can take it up with territorial authorities. The territorial authorities put the price on his head. Then let them come collect him themselves." Wade's hand was on his own gun now. "This is my town, Vance, my jurisdiction, and I say we do this by the book." For a long, terrible moment, Margaret thought Vance might draw. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of odds. 3 bounty hunters against a sheriff, a wounded deputy, and a crowd of armed townspeople. The math didn't favor him. "This ain't over," Vance said finally. He spat in the dirt, then wheeled his horse. "Come on, boys. We'll take this up with the federal marshal." The three bounty hunters thundered out of the yard, leaving a wake of dust and muttered curses. Margaret didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until it came out in a rush. Wade dismounted, walked over to where Jack stood. The two men regarded each other for a long moment, and Margaret could see years of assumption and prejudice being reassessed, recalibrated. "I can't promise this ends well for you," Wade said bluntly. "Federal marshals don't give a damn about local alibis or theories. They'll still want you in custody." "I know," Jack replied. "But at least now there's a chance that someone might actually investigate instead of just assuming." "I'll send telegrams," Wade promised. "To Colorado, to the prison, to every jurisdiction that's got paper on you. I'll ask for records, for witness statements, for anything that might help prove your theory. But Jack," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this could take months, maybe longer. And in the meantime, you're stuck here. You run, you look guilty, you stay. You're a sitting duck for every bounty hunter and glory seeker between here and the Mississippi." "I'm not running." Jack looked at Margaret, and something passed between them. An understanding, a commitment. "I've got work to do here. A fence to finish, a well to dig, a barn to repair. If I'm going to prove I'm not a criminal, I might as well do it by being useful." Wade nodded slowly, then turned to the crowd. "All right, folks, show's over. Go on back to town. And for God's sake, if anyone sees a man matching Jack Coulter's description doing anything suspicious, you come find me immediately. Don't try to be a hero." The crowd began to disperse, though not without plenty of backward glances and whispered conversations. Margaret could feel their speculation like a physical weight. By nightfall, the whole county would know that the widow Hale was harboring an outlaw. Her reputation, what little remained of it, would be completely shredded. She found she didn't care. Sarah rode up to the porch, her normally placid face creased with concern. "Maggie, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once word spreads, let it spread," Margaret said firmly. "I'm doing what's right, Sarah. For the first time in 3 years, I'm doing something that feels right, instead of just expedient." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Thomas would have liked him, I think. Your husband always did admire stubborn men." She gathered her reins. "I'll do what I can in town. Remind people about Christian charity and the presumption of innocence. It won't stop all the talk, but it might slow it down." "Thank you." After Sarah left, after the last of the curious townspeople had ridden away, Margaret turned to find Daniel practically vibrating with excitement. "Does this mean Mr. Jack can stay?" he asked breathlessly. "Does it mean he's not a bad man?" "It means we don't know the whole truth yet," Margaret said carefully. "But yes, Mr. Jack is going to stay for a while. He's going to help us with the ranch work. Can he teach me to shoot? Can he show me how to—" "Daniel, go help Pete with the chickens," Margaret interrupted gently. "Give the adults some time to talk." The boy's face fell, but he obeyed, dragging his feet dramatically across the yard. Margaret watched him go, then turned to Jack. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "I know Wade said you should, but if you want to run, if you want to take your chances elsewhere—" "I gave you my word I'd finish that fence," Jack interrupted. "And I'm a man who keeps his promises, even if it costs me everything. It might cost you your life. Then I'll die with clean hands and honest work to show for my last days." He picked up the hammer, tested its weight. "Besides, I made a promise to James Thornton. He asked me to help you save this ranch. I intend to honor that." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, something warm and terrifying and utterly unexpected. This man, this wanted outlaw with the haunted eyes and gentle hands, was choosing to stay, was choosing to risk everything for a promise made to a dead man and a ranch he had no stake in. "The fence first," she said, making it sound like a decree, "then the well. Then we'll see about everything else." They worked through the heat of the day, Jack on the fence, and Margaret on the 1,000 other tasks that a ranch demanded. Pete kept Daniel occupied and out of trouble, though the boys' questions about their mysterious new hand were endless. Every hour or so, Margaret found herself checking the road, half expecting to see more bounty hunters or federal marshals coming to drag Jack away in chains. But the road stayed empty, and the fence grew longer, and by the time the sun started its descent toward the western peaks, Jack had completed 2/3 of the damaged section. Margaret brought him water and watched as he worked, his shirt discarded in the heat, muscles moving under sun-darkened skin. There were scars there, a patchwork of old wounds that spoke of a hard life and harder lessons. "You're staring," Jack said without looking up from the post hole he was digging. Margaret felt her cheeks heat. "I was just thinking about what Wade said, about this taking months to resolve. Having second thoughts about your hospitality? Having thoughts about the practical considerations? You can't sleep in the barn all winter. Nevada winters are brutal, and that barn's drafty as hell." Jack paused in his digging, leaned on the post hole digger. "What are you suggesting?" "There's a room off the kitchen. It was supposed to be for a hired hand, but we never got around to finishing it. 4 walls, a door, space for a bed and a stove. It's not much, but it's better than the barn." "Mrs. Hale," "Margaret," she corrected. "If you're going to be living here, working here, you might as well use my given name. Mrs. Hale makes me feel like a schoolmarm." A smile ghosted across Jack's face, the first genuine one she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, made him look younger, less burdened. "Margaret, then. And you should call me Jack. Mr. Coulter sounds like my father, and he was a bastard." They worked in companionable silence after that, the easy quiet of people who'd found a rhythm together. When the sun finally touched the ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack drove the last post home and strung the final length of wire. "Done," he announced, stepping back to survey his work. The fence stood straight and strong, a boundary restored. Margaret felt an unexpected surge of emotion looking at it. It was just a fence, just wood and wire, but it represented something more. Proof that the ranch could be saved, that with help and determination, the slow slide into ruin could be reversed. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got that well to dig, and from what Pete tells me, it's going to be a son of a bitch." They walked back to the house as darkness fell, both of them exhausted but satisfied. Pete had made a stew, mostly vegetables with a bit of salt pork for flavoring, and they ate in the kitchen while Daniel peppered Jack with questions about everything from horses to gunfighting to whether he'd ever seen a buffalo. Jack answered patiently, telling stories that made Daniel's eyes go wide with wonder. He talked about the great herds he'd seen in Montana, about nights sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled milk, about the raw beauty and casual cruelty of frontier life. He edited carefully, Margaret noticed, leaving out the violence and hardship, painting a picture of the West that a 7-year-old could admire without having nightmares. After Daniel had been tucked into bed, protesting every step of the way, Margaret and Jack sat on the porch in the cooling night air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered. The sound was lonely and wild and perfectly suited to the moment. "You're good with him," Margaret said. "With Daniel." "I always wanted children," Jack admitted. "Emily and I used to talk about it. 4, we said. 2 boys and 2 girls. We even had names picked out." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny how life works out, or doesn't. You could still have that. When this is over, when your name is cleared—" "If my name is cleared," Jack corrected gently. "And even if it is, I'm 33 years old with nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and 3 years of running to show for my life. What woman would want that?" Margaret was silent for a moment, listening to the night sounds, feeling the weight of all the things she couldn't say. Finally, she stood. "I should check on Daniel, make sure he's actually sleeping and not lying awake planning ways to convince you to teach him trick shooting." "Margaret." Jack's voice stopped her at the door. "Why are you doing this? Really, you could have let Wade take me, could have collected that reward money. God knows you need it more than most." She turned to face him, this man who'd stumbled into her life like a storm, bringing chaos and possibility in equal measure. "Because 3 years ago, my husband died and left me alone with a ranch I didn't know how to run and a son I didn't know how to raise by myself. And every man in this territory looked at me like I was either an opportunity or a problem to be solved. They offered to buy my land for a fraction of what it's worth, offered to marry me so they could take over, offered their help with strings attached that would have cost me everything I have." She took a breath, steadied herself. "You're the first man who showed up here asking for nothing, who's willing to work without demanding ownership or control or anything except the chance to prove you're not who people say you are. Maybe I'm a fool for trusting that. Maybe I'll regret it. But I'd rather be a fool who took a chance on decency than a cynic who turned away the first honest man I've met in years. Jack stood slowly, moved to stand in front of her. In the moonlight, his eyes looked silver, luminous. I'm not a good man, Margaret. I've killed people. I've done things I'm not proud of. You killed men who murdered your brother. You defended yourself. That's not the same as being bad. The law doesn't see it that way. Then the law is wrong. She held his gaze, refusing to look away. You're staying, Jack. We're going to dig that well and fix that barn and get this ranch through the winter. And while we do that, Wade's going to send his telegrams and investigate your case. And somehow, some way, we're going to prove that Porter Daniels has been using your name to commit crimes. We're going to clear your record. And if we can't, Margaret smiled, and it was fierce and determined and utterly without compromise. Then I guess I'll be harboring a fugitive. Wouldn't be the craziest thing I've done. The next morning brought a visitor Margaret hadn't expected, John Henderson, riding up on his big roan gelding with his hat in his hands and an uncomfortable expression on his weathered face. Henderson owned the spread to the south, 3,000 acres of decent grazing land that made Margaret's struggling ranch look like a kitchen garden. He was a hard man, fair in his way, but not given to social calls. Mrs. Hale, he said, nodding from his saddle. Wondered if I might have a word. Margaret set down the bucket she'd been carrying and wiped her hands on her apron. Of course, Mr. Henderson. What can I do for you? Henderson dismounted, stood turning his hat in his hands like a man working up to something difficult. It's about your new hand. The Coulter fellow. Margaret's spine stiffened. What about him? I just wanted to say... Henderson paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I wanted to say that fence he put up yesterday is the finest piece of work I've seen in years. Straight as a surveyor's line, posts sunk deep and true. The kind of work that'll last a decade or more. Whatever Margaret had been expecting, it wasn't that. Thank you? I'm not good with words, Mrs. Hale, so I'll speak plain. There's been talk in town about you taking in a wanted man, about what that means for your reputation and your safety. Some of that talk's been ugly. Henderson's jaw tightened. But I've seen that fence, I've seen the work. And I've been ranching this land for 30 years, and I know the difference between a man who's running and a man who's working. You're Coulter. He's working. He's not my anything, Margaret protested weakly. Henderson smiled, and it softened his hard features. My wife's been after me for weeks to offer you help with your place. Says it's a shame seeing you struggle when we've got hands sitting idle half the time. I told her you were too proud to accept charity. But if you've got a hand who's capable of that kind of work, well, maybe there's paying jobs I could send your way. Fencing, mostly. I've got 2 miles of boundary fence that needs replacing, and my regular crew's tied up with the autumn roundup. Margaret's mind reeled. This was more than an olive branch. This was economic salvation. Fence work paid well, and 2 miles of it would bring in enough money to buy supplies for the winter and then some. That's very generous of you, Mr. Henderson. It's good business, he corrected. Your man can do the work. I need it done. Simple as that. You tell him to come by tomorrow. We'll discuss terms. He mounted his horse, settled his hat. And Mrs. Hale? Don't let the gossips get to you. Half of them wouldn't survive a week doing what you do. The other half are just bitter that you're succeeding where they'd have failed. He rode off before Margaret could respond, leaving her standing in the yard with her mouth open and hope blooming in her chest like wildflowers after rain. Jack emerged from the barn, hay dust in his hair, and a question in his eyes. What did Henderson want? He wants to hire you, Margaret said, still processing. 2 miles of fence work, paying work. Something flickered across Jack's face. Surprise, pleasure, and underneath it all, a kind of desperate gratitude. He knows who I am? He knows what you are. A good worker who does quality work. The rest apparently doesn't matter as much as I thought it would. They stood there in the morning sun, Margaret and Jack, 2 people who'd been beaten down by life and circumstance, finding in each other's company something neither had expected. Possibility. We should get started on that well, Jack said finally. If I'm going to be doing Henderson's fencing, I need to get your work done first. Priorities. Margaret smiled. Priorities. Yes, the well first, then we'll worry about everything else. But as they walked toward the drying well, Both of them knew the truth. The well was just water. The fence was just wood and wire. What they were really building was something far more fragile and far more essential. Trust, and maybe, just maybe, redemption. The well proved to be every bit the son of a bitch that Pete had promised. Jack spent the better part of 2 weeks down in that hole, descending each morning into darkness with a pickaxe and a bucket, chipping away at rock and clay while Margaret worked the pulley system above, hauling up debris until her shoulders screamed and her palms were raw despite the gloves. Daniel helped when he could, his small hands surprisingly strong from years of ranch work, and even old Pete contributed what he could, mixing mortar for the stone lining and keeping careful measurements of their progress. They hit water on the 14th day, a sudden gush that soaked Jack to the skin and sent him scrambling up the rope ladder, laughing like a madman. Margaret had never seen him laugh like that, full-throated and genuine, the sound of a man who'd forgotten what joy felt like and was rediscovering it in the most unlikely of places. She found herself laughing too, and Daniel was whooping and dancing in the mud, and for a moment the three of them were just people celebrating a hard-won victory, not a widow and an outlaw and a fatherless boy trying to survive against impossible odds. "We did it," Jack said, dripping wet and grinning ear to ear. "Damn me, we actually did it." "Language," Margaret chided, but she was smiling too broadly to make it stick. "Daniel's impressionable." "Damn's not so bad," Daniel piped up. "Pete says worse when he thinks I'm not listening." "Pete's an old man who's earned the right to curse," Margaret said. "You haven't. Now go get Mr. Jack a towel before he catches his death." Daniel scampered off, still celebrating, and Margaret turned to Jack. His shirt was plastered to his skin, his hair dripping into his eyes, and he looked happier than she'd ever seen him. The haunted quality that usually shadowed his features had lifted, replaced by something lighter, freer. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For this. For everything." Jack's expression softened. "You're paying me, remember? Henderson's fence work starts next week." "I'm not talking about the work." Margaret gestured vaguely at the well, the repaired fence, the barn where Jack had already replaced a dozen rotten boards. "I'm talking about what you've done for this place. For Daniel. For me." Margaret... Whatever he'd been about to say was cut off by the sound of hoofbeats coming fast up the road. Margaret's heart clenched, the old fear returning. More bounty hunters? Federal marshals? But when the rider came into view, she recognized Sheriff Wade Garrett's bay gelding, and the sheriff himself looked grim as he pulled up in the yard. "Wade," Margaret said, her voice tight. "What's wrong?" The sheriff dismounted heavily, looking older than his years. "I've got news. Some good, some bad. All of it complicated." He looked at Jack. "You might want to sit down for this." They gathered in the kitchen, the four adults around the scarred wooden table while Daniel played outside under strict orders not to eavesdrop. Wade accepted the coffee Margaret poured but didn't drink it, just wrapped his hands around the cup like he needed something to hold on to. "I've been sending telegrams like I promised," he began, "to Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, everywhere that's got paper on you, Jack. Been asking for records, witness statements, anything that might help prove your story about Porter Daniels using your name." "And?" Jack's voice was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "And I got responses. Lots of them." Wade pulled a sheaf of papers from his jacket, spread them on the table. "Here's what we know. The original robbery in Silver Creek, Colorado, the one you were convicted for, the witnesses who identified you were all bank employees. The teller, the manager, 2 clerks. All of them swore up and down that you were one of the robbers." Margaret's heart sank, but Wade held up a hand. "Here's the interesting part. I tracked down the teller, a man named Joseph Reeves. He's working at a bank in Denver now. When I asked him to describe the robber he saw, he gave me a description that matches you, Jack. But when I asked him specific questions, scars, distinctive features, anything that would positively identify you, he couldn't give me anything definite. Said it all happened so fast, said the robbers wore bandanas over their faces." "They were masked?" Jack leaned forward. "That wasn't in the trial testimony." "No, it wasn't," Wade agreed, which got me curious. So I dug deeper. Turns out the testimony at your trial came from depositions, not live witnesses. And those depositions were taken by a deputy named Samuel Crenshaw, who... He paused significantly. Was fired 6 months later for accepting bribes and falsifying evidence in an unrelated case. Margaret felt hope stir in her chest. So the evidence against Jack was tainted? Possibly, probably, but here's where it gets complicated. Wade shuffled through his papers. I also got information about the other robberies, the ones that have happened since Jack escaped from prison. 7 banks in 3 years, just like that newspaper man said. And I found something interesting. In 4 of those 7 robberies, witnesses specifically mentioned that the robber had a tattoo on his right forearm, an eagle, they said, with spread wings. Jack pushed up his sleeves without being asked, displaying both forearms, clean skin, scarred in places but unmarked by ink. I've never had a tattoo in my life. I can see that, which means either the witnesses were lying or mistaken, or the man robbing those banks isn't you. Wade pulled out one more paper, this one a wanted poster. It showed a rough sketch of a man who did indeed resemble Jack, same general build and features, but with enough differences that Margaret could see it wasn't him. The nose was wrong, the chin too sharp, the eyes set too close together. This is the poster they're circulating now, Wade said, based on witness descriptions from the recent robberies. It's supposed to be you, Jack, but it's not, is it? It's Porter Daniels, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. That's him. That's the son of a bitch who killed my brother and framed me for it. Wade nodded slowly. I sent this poster to the prison in Cannon City, asked them to show it around to guards and other prisoners who might have known you. Got a response yesterday. 3 guards all said the same thing. This poster doesn't look much like Jack Coulter. Close enough if you're not paying attention, similar enough to fool someone who'd only seen you from a distance, but not a match for anyone who'd actually met you. Margaret's hands were shaking. This is good news, isn't it? This proves Jack's innocent. It proves there's reasonable doubt, Wade corrected carefully. It proves that the identification evidence is questionable and that someone else might be committing crimes under Jack's name. But it doesn't prove Jack's innocence, not in the legal sense. For that, we'd need to actually catch Porter Daniels. We'd need him to confess or be positively identified by multiple reliable witnesses. So I'm still a wanted man, Jack said flatly. Still have bounty hunters after me, still can't go anywhere without looking over my shoulder. For now, yes. But I've sent all this information to the territorial governor and to the federal marshal's office. I've requested that your case be reviewed, that the conviction be examined for irregularities. That's going to take time, months probably, but it's a start. Wade's expression softened. And in the meantime, I've got something else that might help. The bank that was robbed here in Copper Ridge? The manager got a good look at the robber. I showed him that sketch, asked if that was the man he saw. He said, yes, absolutely, no question. Then I showed him your photograph, the one from the prison. I didn't know you had my photograph, Jack said. Had to send for it from Cannon City. Took 2 weeks to arrive. Wade pulled out a small tintype, showed it to Margaret. She'd never seen Jack look so young, so defeated. It must have been taken right after his arrest, before the trial, when he'd still had hope that justice would prevail. I showed this to the bank manager and asked if this was the robber. You know what he said? Margaret held her breath. He said no. Said the man in the photograph might be related to the robber, might even be his brother, but it wasn't the same man. The robber was harder somehow, meaner looking, had that tattoo on his arm. This man in the photograph looked too young, too soft. Jack laughed, but it was a broken sound. Soft. 3 years in prison and 3 years running, and I looked soft. You looked innocent, Wade said quietly. You looked like a man who'd been wrongly accused. And that bank manager, he's willing to testify to that effect if it comes to it. So are 2 of the hostages who got a good look at the robber. They'll all swear that you and the man who robbed our bank are not the same person. Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. Wade, this is incredible. This could actually work. It's a start, the sheriff repeated, but we're not out of the woods yet. There's still the federal marshals to deal with, and they don't give 2 shits about local alibis or questionable identifications. Far as they're concerned, Jack's a convicted criminal who escaped from prison. Until a judge formally overturns that conviction, he's still wanted. How long? Jack asked. How long until we know? Wade shrugged. Could be 3 months. Could be a year. Legal system moves slow, especially when you're trying to overturn a conviction. The prosecutor who tried your case, He's not going to want to admit he got it wrong. The judge who sentenced you, same thing. We're fighting against people's pride and reputations here, not just evidence. So what do I do? Just sit here and wait? Hope that Daniels doesn't show up? Hope that some bounty hunter doesn't get lucky? You keep your head down, Wade said firmly. You work Henderson's fence, you help Margaret with her ranch, you stay out of trouble. You give me time to build a case, to gather evidence, to convince the right people that justice wasn't served the first time around. He stood, picked up his hat. And Jack? You stay alive. Because if you get yourself killed before I can clear your name, all this work will have been for nothing. After Wade left, Margaret and Jack sat in silence for a long time. The kitchen was warm, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, but Margaret felt cold. 3 months to a year. A year of living in limbo, of looking over their shoulders, of not knowing if the next rider up the road would be bringing salvation or damnation. I should go, Jack said finally. This is too much to ask of you. A year of harboring a fugitive, a year of putting yourself and Daniel at risk. Stop. Margaret's voice was sharp. Just stop. We've had this conversation already, and my answer hasn't changed. You're staying. We're seeing this through. Margaret, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Reasonable would be accepting your help for as long as you're willing to give it. Reasonable would be not throwing away the first decent thing that's happened to this ranch in 3 years just because it's complicated. She stood, paced to the window, looked out at the land she'd fought so hard to keep. You've put in a well that will last 20 years. You've built fence that won't fall down in the first strong wind. You've shown my son what it means to work with integrity and purpose. And you're telling me I should throw all that away because some federal marshal might cause trouble? It's not just might. They will cause trouble. Then let them come. Let them see what you've built here. Let them try to convince this community that a man who spends 14 days digging a well is a dangerous criminal. Margaret turned to face him, her jaw set. I'm not afraid of trouble, Jack. I've been dealing with trouble since the day Thomas died and left me alone with more debts than assets and a whole territory of men who thought I should just give up and sell out. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that running from trouble doesn't make it go away. It just means you face it on its terms instead of yours. Jack stood, moved to stand beside her at the window. Outside, Daniel was playing with a stick, chasing chickens and laughing. The sound was pure and uncomplicated, a child's joy unmarred by adult concerns. He deserves better than this, Jack said quietly. Better than having a wanted man living in his house, putting his mother at risk. He deserves to see his mother fight for what's right instead of what's easy, Margaret countered. He deserves to learn that people are innocent until proven guilty, that sometimes the law gets it wrong, that doing the right thing often means taking risks. She looked up at Jack, this man who'd become so much more than a stranger who'd stepped off a train. And maybe, just maybe, he deserves to see what it looks like when two broken people help each other heal. Jack's breath caught. For a long moment they stood there, close enough that Margaret could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the flecks of darker gray in his storm-colored eyes. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her hand. I don't know how to do this, he said softly. Any of this. I don't know how to be the man you seem to think I am. Then we'll figure it out together, Margaret said. Day by day, fence by fence, well by well. We'll figure it out. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Jack worked Henderson's fence during the day, rising before dawn and returning after sunset, his hands blistered and his back aching, but his spirit lighter than Margaret had ever seen it. Henderson paid fair wages and apparently had no qualms about hiring a wanted man, especially one who did such quality work. Word spread, and soon Jack had offers from other ranchers in the territory. Roof repairs, barn building, fence work, all the jobs that required skilled hands and honest labor. Margaret managed the money carefully, paying down debts and buying supplies for the winter. For the first time since Thomas died, she could see a future beyond mere survival. The ranch wasn't just holding on anymore. It was actually improving. The cattle that had been slowly dying off were now thriving, thanks to the new well and the repaired fencing that kept them from wandering onto poor grazing land. The barn was weather-tight, the house was solid, and there was food in the larder and hay in the loft. Daniel flourished under Jack's quiet attention. The boy had been starved for male companionship, for someone to show him how to rope and ride and handle the 1,000 small skills that made a rancher. Pete did what he could, but he was old and his body was failing him. Jack was patient and thorough, teaching Daniel not just the mechanics of ranch work, but the philosophy behind it, respect for the animals, stewardship of the land, the dignity of honest labor. "You're good with him," Margaret said one evening, watching Jack show Daniel how to properly saddle a horse. "He's learning more from you in a few weeks than he learned from Thomas in years." Jack glanced over, and there was something soft in his expression. Thomas was busy building an empire. That takes time and focus. He probably figured he'd teach Daniel later, when the boy was older. "He ran out of time," Margaret said quietly. "That's what this country does. It takes time away from you. One day you're planning for the future, and the next day you're dead in a hotel room 300 miles from home, and all your plans die with you." "Is that what scares you, running out of time?" Margaret considered the question. A month ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. But now, standing in the yard of a ranch that was finally thriving, watching her son learn from a good man, feeling something warm and terrifying growing in her chest every time Jack smiled at her, now the answer was more complicated. "What scares me is wasting the time I have," she said finally. "Thomas spent his whole life chasing the next thing, the next opportunity, the next success. He was never content with what he had, never stopped to appreciate the moment he was in. And then he died. And all that chasing came to nothing." She looked at Jack directly. "I don't want to live like that. I don't want to be so focused on survival that I forget to actually live." Jack's throat worked as he swallowed. "What are you saying, Margaret?" "I'm saying that life is short and uncertain, and I'm tired of being afraid." She took a breath, steadied herself. "I'm saying that I like having you here. I like the way Daniel looks up to you. I like the sound of your voice in the morning and the sight of you coming up the road at sunset. I like who I am when you're around, stronger, braver, more like the woman I thought I'd be when I married Thomas and came west." "Margaret," his voice was rough, choked. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments or anything you can't give," she continued quickly, before her courage failed. "I know you might have to run tomorrow. I know federal marshals or bounty hunters could show up any day. I know this could all end badly, but I also know that right now, in this moment, I'm happier than I've been in years. And I'm not going to apologize for that." Jack crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and then his hands were cupping her face and his eyes were searching hers. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve any of this." "That's not your choice to make," Margaret said. "I'm the one who gets to decide what I deserve. And I deserve to be happy, even if it's only for a little while, even if it all goes to hell tomorrow." He kissed her then, gentle and questioning, like he was afraid she might break. Margaret kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and fear and desperate hope she'd been carrying, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, 2 wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's arms. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "If they come for me, then we'll deal with it," Margaret said firmly. "Together. But until then, we live, we work, we take care of this ranch and this boy and each other. Agreed?" "Agreed," Jack whispered. From across the yard, Daniel's voice rang out. "Are you two going to kiss again, or can Mr. Jack finish teaching me about saddles?" They broke apart, both blushing like teenagers. Margaret saw Pete standing on the porch, a knowing smile on his weathered face. The old man had probably seen this coming weeks before either of them had admitted it to themselves. "Saddles, Daniel," Jack called back, his voice only slightly unsteady. "Definitely saddles." But as he walked back to where the boy waited, he looked over his shoulder at Margaret, and the expression on his face was so full of hope and fear and longing that it took her breath away. The trouble came on a Thursday afternoon in early October, when the aspens in the high country were turning gold and the air had that crystalline quality that presaged winter. Margaret was in the kitchen making preserves when she heard riders approaching, too many riders, moving too fast. Her heart lurched as she wiped her hands and moved to the window. 6 men, all armed, all wearing the unmistakable badge of federal marshals. At their head rode a man she didn't recognize, tall and severe in a black coat, his face carved from granite. Behind him, looking uncomfortable, was Sheriff Wade Garrett. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. They'd come. After all Wade's telegrams and investigations, after all the evidence suggesting Jack's innocence, they'd come anyway. Jack was out at Henderson's place, working on the last section of fence. He wouldn't be back until sunset, which meant Margaret would have to face this alone. She stepped out onto the porch, her spine straight and her chin high. "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" The man in the black coat dismounted, his movements precise and controlled. "Ma'am, I'm Marshal Theodore Blackwood, federal jurisdiction. I'm looking for a man named Jack Coulter. I have information he's been staying here." "And if he has been," Margaret kept her voice level, "then I need to speak with him. We have questions about several bank robberies, including one that occurred in this territory." Blackwood's eyes were cold, assessing. "Sheriff Garrett here has been filling my ears with stories about alibis and mistaken identity. I'd like to hear Mr. Coulter's version of events." "Jack's not here right now. He's working at the Henderson Ranch." "Then we'll wait." Blackwood gestured to his men, who began to dismount. "You'll wait off my property," Margaret said sharply. "This is private land, Marshal, and you don't have a warrant." Blackwood's expression didn't change. "I have federal authority, Mrs. Hale. I don't need a warrant." "The hell you don't." Wade's voice was tight with anger as he stepped forward. "Mrs. Hale's right. This is her property, and unless you've got a specific warrant for Jack Coulter's arrest, you need her permission to be here." "Sheriff Garrett, I appreciate your local perspective, but this is a federal matter. It's a matter of respecting property rights and due process," Wade interrupted. "Things that apply to federal marshals same as everyone else." The tension in the yard was thick enough to choke on. Margaret could see Blackwood's jaw tighten, could see his men shifting nervously. This could go bad fast. "Marshal Blackwood," she said carefully, "I'm willing to cooperate. But I'd appreciate it if you'd extend the same courtesy. Jack Coulter isn't running. He's been here for over a month, working honestly, helping me save my ranch. He'll be back at sunset, and I give you my word he'll talk to you. But I'm asking you, as a courtesy, to wait at the sheriff's office in town rather than on my property. I have a young son here, and I don't want him frightened by armed men surrounding his home." Blackwood studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "That's reasonable. We'll wait in town. But Mrs. Hale, if Jack Coulter doesn't show up, if he runs, I'll consider you an accessory. Do you understand?" "He won't run," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "You have my word." After the marshals left, Wade lingered. "Maggie, you need to know, Blackwood's not like me. He doesn't care about evidence or alibis or reasonable doubt. He's got orders to bring Jack in, and he'll do it by whatever means necessary." "Then we'll convince him he's got the wrong man." "And if we can't?" Margaret looked at the sheriff, this good man who'd been trying so hard to help despite the risk to his own career. "Then I guess we find out exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect someone I care about." Wade sighed, settled his hat more firmly on his head. "You've got until sunset. Make it count." Margaret rode to Henderson's ranch like the devil himself was chasing her, pushing her mare harder than she should have, her heart hammering against her ribs with every hoofbeat. The sun was still high, maybe 3 hours until sunset, and she needed every minute of that time. She needed to warn Jack, needed to prepare him, needed to figure out how they were going to face Marshal Blackwood without everything falling apart. She found Jack on the far western boundary of Henderson's property, working alone on a stretch of fence that ran along a rocky outcropping. He was shirtless despite the October chill, his skin gleaming with sweat, and he looked up at the sound of her approach with a smile that died the moment he saw her face. "What's wrong?" He dropped his tools, was at her side before she'd even dismounted. "Federal marshals," Margaret said, breathless from the ride and the fear. 6 of them, led by a man named Blackwood. They're waiting in town. They want to talk to you." Jack's face went carefully blank, the shutters coming down over his eyes. "When?" "Sunset. I told them you'd come in, that you weren't running." She grabbed his arm, felt the tension coiled in his muscles like a spring wound too tight. "Jack, please tell me I didn't lie. Please tell me you're not going to run." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon like he was already mapping escape routes. Margaret felt her heart crack, felt the fragile hope she'd been building start to crumble. "I could be in Utah by tomorrow. he said quietly. Wyoming by the end of the week. I know places where federal marshals don't go, places where a man can disappear if he's careful. And then what? You spend the rest of your life running, looking over your shoulder, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home? Margaret's voice broke. Is that really what you want? What I want doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you safe, keeping Daniel safe. If I talk to Blackwood, if he takes me in, Margaret, they'll hang me. The evidence Wade's been gathering, it doesn't mean anything to federal courts. I'm an escaped convict. That alone is enough for a death sentence. Then we fight. We bring the witnesses, we show them the evidence, we prove that Porter Daniels has been using your name, and how long do you think that will take? Months? Years? Jack's hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. I won't ask you to wait that long. I won't ask you to spend years visiting me in some federal prison while lawyers argue over technicalities. You're not asking, I'm offering. Margaret covered his hands with hers, held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had started spinning out of control. Don't you understand? I've spent 3 years watching this ranch die, watching my son grow up without a father, watching my dreams turn to dust. And then you showed up, this impossible, stubborn, honorable man who fixed my fence and dug my well and taught my son how to be strong. You think I'm going to let you walk away now? You think I'm going to let them hang you for crimes you didn't commit? Margaret, I love you. The words came out fierce and desperate and utterly true. I know it's too soon and too complicated, and maybe I'm a fool for saying it, but I don't care. I love you, Jack Coulter, and I'm not letting you run. I'm not letting you give up. We're going to face those marshals together, and we're going to prove your innocence, and somehow, some way, we're going to build a life that doesn't involve constantly looking over our shoulders. Jack's expression crumpled, years of pain and loneliness and desperate longing breaking through the careful control he maintained. I love you too, he whispered. God help me. I think I loved you from the moment you stepped between me and Wade's gun on that train platform. But loving you doesn't change the facts. It doesn't change what I am. You're a good man who was dealt a bad hand, Margaret said firmly. That's what you are. And good men don't run. They stand and fight. Isn't that what you told Daniel just last week? That real strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified. Jack laughed, but it was wet with unshed tears. Using my own words against me? That's playing dirty, Mrs. Hale. Whatever works, Mr. Coulter. She pulled his head down, kissed him hard and desperate, trying to pour everything she felt into that kiss, all her fear and hope and stubborn, impossible love. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she said, We go into town. We talk to Blackwood. We show him everything Wade's gathered, and we pray that justice actually means something in this God-forsaken territory. Jack was quiet for a moment, his forehead resting against hers, his hands trembling slightly where they cupped her face. Then he straightened, and when he looked at her, there was steel in his eyes, the kind of determination that had kept him alive through 3 years on the run, but tempered now with something else. Hope, maybe, or faith in something larger than just survival. All right, he said, we do this your way. But if it goes bad, if Blackwood won't listen, Margaret, you have to promise me you'll let it go. You'll take Daniel and get on with your life. You won't waste years fighting a battle you can't win. I'm not promising anything except that I'll stand beside you for as long as you'll let me, Margaret said. Now put your shirt on and let's go face down some federal marshals. They rode back to the ranch together, side by side, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the prairie. At the house, they found Pete waiting on the porch with Daniel, the old man's face grave and the boy's eyes wide with barely contained excitement. Daniel thinks the marshals are coming to arrest you, Pete said without preamble. I didn't see the point in lying to him. Are they? Daniel asked, his voice smaller than usual. Are they going to take Mr. Jack away? Jack knelt down so he was eye level with the boy, his hands resting gently on Daniel's shoulders. They might try, partner, but I want you to know something. Whatever happens, everything I taught you about being honest, about working hard, about treating people with respect, all of that is true. Sometimes the world isn't fair. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to be good. You understand? Daniel's lower lip was trembling. I don't want you to go. I know. I don't want to go either. Jack pulled the boy into a hug, and Margaret had to look away, her throat too tight to breathe. But your mama's the bravest, strongest woman I've ever met, and she's going to take care of you no matter what happens. You trust her, all right? I trust both of you, Daniel said, his face buried in Jack's shoulder. They left Daniel with Pete and rode into town as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Copper Ridge's main street was unusually crowded for a Thursday afternoon. Word had spread about the federal marshals, and it seemed like half the territory had turned out to see what would happen. Margaret could feel their eyes on her and Jack as they rode past, could hear the whispers. Some were sympathetic, some were judgmental, but all were curious. Wade was waiting outside his office, and beside him stood Marshal Blackwood and his men. Blackwood's expression was unreadable as Jack dismounted, his hands carefully away from his gun. Marshal, Jack said evenly. I'm Jack Coulter. I understand you wanted to speak with me. Inside, Blackwood said curtly. He gestured to his men. Disarm him. That's not necessary, Wade started, but Blackwood cut him off with a sharp look. He's a convicted criminal and an escaped prisoner. I'll not have him armed in an interrogation. Blackwood's voice brooked no argument. Jack unbuckled his gun belt slowly, handed it to Wade. It's all right, Sheriff. The marshal's just doing his job. They filed into Wade's office. Blackwood, two of his deputies, Wade, Jack, and Margaret. The marshal had tried to exclude her, but she'd simply walked in and sat down like she had every right to be there, and apparently Blackwood had decided that particular battle wasn't worth fighting. Jack Coulter, Blackwood began, pulling out a file thick with papers. You were convicted of bank robbery and murder in Silver Creek, Colorado in 1876. You were sentenced to hang, but before the sentence could be carried out, you escaped from the territorial prison at Cannon City. Since then, you've been wanted in connection with 7 additional bank robberies across 5 territories. Do you deny any of this? I deny the original conviction was just, Jack said calmly. I never robbed that bank. I never killed anyone who didn't deserve killing. And the man you're looking for, the man who's been robbing banks under my name, is Porter Daniels, one of the men who actually committed the crime I was convicted of. That's a convenient story, Blackwood said. Do you have any proof? I have proof. Wade stepped forward, laying out the papers he'd been gathering for weeks. Witness statements, the testimony from the Copper Ridge bank manager, the prison guard reports, the telegraph from the former bank teller admitting the robbers had been masked. Jack Coulter was here in Copper Ridge when our bank was robbed. Multiple witnesses can confirm it, and the man who robbed our bank matches the description of the man who's been robbing banks all across the territory, including having a tattoo that Jack doesn't have. Blackwood examined the papers with the kind of thoroughness that would have been encouraging if his expression hadn't remained so cold. Witness testimony is notoriously unreliable, Sheriff, and alibis can be fabricated, especially when provided by someone with a vested interest. His gaze flicked to Margaret. Someone who's been harboring a fugitive. I haven't been harboring a fugitive, Margaret said, her voice sharp. I've been employing a ranch hand, a good one, who's helped save my property and been nothing but honest and hard-working since the day he arrived. Mrs. Hale, with all respect, your personal feelings about Mr. Coulter don't change the facts. He's an escaped convict. Regardless of whether he committed the original crime, he broke out of a federal prison. That alone is enough to hang him. The room went silent. Margaret felt ice water flooding her veins, felt the fragile hope she'd been clinging to start to shatter. Blackwood was right. Even if they could prove Jack's innocence of the robberies, the escape itself was a capital crime. There has to be something we can do, Wade said, and Margaret could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Some legal avenue. There is one possibility, Blackwood interrupted. He was looking at Jack now with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. The man who's been committing these robberies, this Porter Daniels you've named, he robbed a bank in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago, killed a guard and a customer during the robbery. The territorial governor has put a substantial bounty on his head, $5,000, dead or alive. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. What are you saying? I'm saying that if someone were to apprehend Porter Daniels, were to bring him in to face justice, the territorial governor would be very grateful. Grateful enough, perhaps, to review the case of a man who was convicted on questionable evidence and whose supposed crime seemed to have been committed by someone else. Jack leaned forward. "You want me to catch Daniels?" "I want justice," Blackwood corrected. "If Daniels is really the man behind these robberies, then he needs to be stopped. And you, Mr. Coulter, are the only person who knows what he looks like. The only person who can identify him with certainty." He paused. "I'm prepared to offer you a deal. Help us catch Daniels, and I'll personally recommend to the territorial governor that your case be reviewed and your conviction overturned." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "Then I take you into custody right now, transport you back to Cannon City, and you hang within the month. Those are your options, Mr. Coulter. Choose wisely." Margaret wanted to scream, wanted to overturn the desk and throw Blackwood out of the office. This was coercion, pure and simple. But looking at Jack's face, she saw him doing the same calculation she was, weighing the odds, measuring the risks. It was a trap, but it was also the only chance they had. "How would this work?" Jack asked slowly. "We know Daniel's pattern. He hits small-town banks, usually targets places with limited law enforcement. Based on his previous robberies, we believe his next target will be somewhere in the Nevada or Utah territories, probably within the next month." Blackwood pulled out a map, spread it on Wade's desk. "There are 6 likely targets. We station men at each location, wait for Daniels to make his move. When he does, we take him. You'll be there to make the positive identification." "You're using my town as bait," Wade said, his voice tight with anger. "I'm trying to catch a dangerous criminal, Sheriff. If you have a better suggestion, I'm open to hearing it." Wade had no answer to that, and neither did Margaret. It was a terrible plan, fraught with risk and dependent on too many variables. But it was also the only plan that gave Jack a chance at freedom. "I'll do it," Jack said, "but I have conditions." Blackwood's eyebrow rose. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate." "And yet I am." Jack's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "My first condition is that Mrs. Hale and her son are protected. If Daniels comes anywhere near Copper Ridge, I want federal marshals guarding her property 24 hours a day." "Done," Blackwood said without hesitation. "Second, when we catch Daniels, and we will catch him, I want his confession. I want him to admit on record that he framed me, that he committed the robberies I was convicted of. I want my name cleared completely, not just pardoned." Blackwood considered this. "I can't promise he'll confess, but if he does, it will be documented and submitted as evidence in your case review." "Third," Jack continued, "Sheriff Garrett stays involved in the investigation. He's the one who's been gathering evidence, the one who knows this case inside and out. I want him as part of the team bringing Daniels in." "The sheriff has his own jurisdiction to worry about." "That's my condition," Jack said flatly. "Wade's earned the right to see this through. Without his work, you wouldn't even know Daniel's name." Blackwood looked at Wade, who nodded slowly. "All right. The sheriff can participate. Any other demands?" "Just one." Jack stood, moved to stand beside Margaret's chair. "When this is over, when Daniels is caught and my name is cleared, I want to be able to stay here. I want to work this ranch, help raise that boy, build a life with this woman. I want what was stolen from me 3 years ago. A chance at peace." Something flickered in Blackwood's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "If you catch Daniels and your name is cleared, Mr. Coulter, you'll be free to do whatever you want. You have my word on that." They shook on it, though Margaret noticed Jack's hand was trembling slightly when he released the marshal's grip. Blackwood and his men filed out, leaving instructions to meet at the federal office in Carson City in 2 days to begin planning the operation. Wade lingered, his face troubled. "Jack, you know this is dangerous as hell, right? If Daniels realizes you're onto him, he'll try to kill me." "I know." Jack's jaw was set. "But it's the only shot I've got, and I'm not going back to prison, Wade. I'll die first." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," the sheriff said. He clapped Jack on the shoulder. "I'll start making preparations. And Jack, you've got more people in this town on your side than you might think. Word spread about the work you've done, the kind of man you are. If it comes to a fight, you won't be facing it alone." After Wade left, Margaret and Jack stood in the empty office, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like snow. Outside, the sun was touching the ridge, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "We should get back to the ranch," Margaret said quietly. "Daniel will be worried." But neither of them moved. They stood there in the gathering dusk, holding on to each other like drowning people clutching driftwood, trying to find solid ground in a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. "I'm scared," Jack admitted. "I've been running for so long, I don't know how to stand and fight anymore." "Then you'll learn," Margaret said. "We'll both learn, together." The next 2 weeks were a strange kind of limbo. Jack spent his days in Carson City working with Blackwood and the other federal marshals, planning the operation to catch Porter Daniels. Margaret stayed at the ranch, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Daniel's sake, while federal deputies camped on her property, watching the roads for any sign of trouble. John Henderson continued to send work Jack's way, as did other ranchers in the territory. It was their way of showing support, Margaret realized, giving Jack legitimate employment, treating him like a valued member of the community rather than a wanted criminal. She was grateful for it, for the way these hard, practical men had decided that Jack's character mattered more than the paper on him. Sarah Chen visited regularly, bringing supplies and gossip from town. The sentiment was mixed, she reported. Some folks thought Margaret was a fool for standing by a wanted man. Others admired her courage. A surprising number seemed to believe that Jack was innocent and that the federal government had gotten it wrong. Tom Wu started a petition, Sarah said one afternoon over coffee, asking the territorial governor to review Jack's case even if they don't catch this Daniels fellow. He's got over 200 signatures already. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep fighting. Say you won't let them railroad a good man just because it's easier than admitting they made a mistake." Sarah squeezed her hand. "People around here, we know what it takes to survive in this country. We know the difference between a man who's running from justice and a man who's running from injustice. Jack's the latter, and folks recognize that." On the 15th day, Jack came home looking grim. He'd been in Carson City for 3 days straight, and the exhaustion showed in the lines around his eyes, the tightness of his jaw. "They've narrowed it down," he said without preamble. "Based on Daniel's pattern and recent intelligence, they think he's going to hit either the bank in Silver Springs or the one in Austin. Both are small towns, both have minimal law enforcement, both fit his profile." "When?" Margaret asked. "Could be any day now. Blackwood wants marshals in position by tomorrow." Jack ran his hands through his hair. "Margaret, I need you to promise me something. If this goes bad, if Daniels kills me, or if I have to kill him and they arrest me anyway, I need you to promise you'll move on. You'll sell this place if you have to, take Daniel somewhere safe, build a new life." "I'm not making that promise," Margaret said flatly. "You want me to promise something? Fine. I promise that when you catch Daniels and clear your name, I'm going to marry you. Right here on this ranch, with Daniel and Pete and half of Copper Ridge as witnesses. That's the promise I'm making." Jack stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "Margaret, I haven't even asked." "Then ask." He laughed, sudden and surprised, and for a moment he looked years younger. "Margaret Hale, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making up for the trouble I've brought to your door? Will you let me be a father to Daniel and a partner to you and a man who finally has something worth fighting for?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "To all of it, yes." They sealed it with a kiss that tasted of coffee and hope and desperate, impossible love. Then Jack packed his saddlebags and checked his gun and prepared to ride out with Blackwood's marshals to face the man who'd stolen his life. The trap was set in Austin, a tiny mining town nestled in the Toyabe Range, where the bank sat on Main Street like a fat pigeon waiting for a hawk. Federal marshals took up positions in the hotel across the street, in the saloon next door, in the general store, in the livery, and every other building with a clear line of sight. Jack was stationed with Blackwood in the marshal's office, watching through field glasses, waiting for a ghost to materialize. 3 days they waited. 3 days of tension wound so tight Jack thought he might snap. 3 days of watching every stranger who rode into town, searching for a face he'd seen in his nightmares for 3 years. On the 4th day, just after noon, Porter Daniels walked into the Bank of Austin like he owned the place. Jack saw him through the field glasses, and his blood turned to ice. It was like looking into a twisted mirror, the same height and build, the same dark hair. But where Jack's features were angular and weathered, Daniel's were sharper, meaner. And there, clear as day on his right forearm as he reached for his gun, was the eagle tattoo the witnesses had described. "That's him?" Jack said, his voice tight. "That's Porter Daniels." Blackwood was already moving, marshals pouring out of their hiding places, surrounding the bank. Jack followed, his heart hammering, his hand on his gun. This was it. 3 years of running, 3 years of being hunted, all coming down to this moment. Daniels came out of the bank with a sack of money in one hand and a gun in the other, and he froze when he saw the marshals. For a split second his eyes met Jack's across the dusty street, and recognition flared, followed immediately by fury. "You son of a bitch!" Daniels snarled. "You were supposed to hang." "Drop your weapon," Blackwood ordered. "You're surrounded." Daniels looked around, saw the marshals, saw the rifles trained on him from every angle. He was calculating. Jack could see it, weighing his odds. And then, with the desperate recklessness of a man with nothing left to lose, he raised his gun. The street erupted in gunfire. Jack dove for cover behind a water trough, heard bullets thudding into the wood above his head. Through the chaos, he saw Daniels firing wildly, saw 2 marshals go down, saw Blackwood take aim with the cold precision of a man who'd done this 100 times. And then Daniels was turning, running for the alley between the bank and the general store, and Jack was on his feet before he could think, before he could calculate the risk. He couldn't let Daniels escape, couldn't let this chance slip away. He rounded the corner of the alley and found Daniels waiting, his gun leveled at Jack's chest. "You ruined everything," Daniels hissed. "That was supposed to be my money, my fresh start. Blake and Worth, they were supposed to take the fall, and you were supposed to hang for killing them." "Why did you kill Sam?" Jack asked, his own gun steady despite the rage burning in his chest. "He was just a lawyer trying to help people. He never hurt anyone. He was going to expose us. He had proof we'd been stealing from those farmers, proof that would have sent us all to prison." Daniel's face was twisted with hate. "We had to stop him, had to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. But then you showed up, playing the avenging brother, and we had to adjust the plan. Frame you, steal the money anyway, disappear while you took the fall." "And it worked," Jack said bitterly. "For 3 years it worked. You got away with murder, and I got a noose." "Should have stayed hanged," Daniel spit. "Should have accepted your fate like a man instead of breaking out and ruining everything. Every bank I robbed under your name, every crime attributed to Jack Coulter, that should have been mine. That reputation, that fear, that respect, it should have been mine." "You're insane," Jack said quietly. "I'm practical." Daniels was screaming now, spittle flying. "You were a nobody, a ranch hand with a bleeding heart and a dead brother. I gave you immortality. I made you famous." "You made me a hunted man," Jack corrected. "You stole my life, and now I'm taking it back." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, but Jack was faster, had always been faster. His shot caught Daniels in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot took him in the leg, dropping him. Blackwood and the other marshals poured into the alley, guns drawn, but the fight was over. Daniels lay bleeding in the dirt, cursing and writhing, and Jack stood over him with his gun still raised, his hand rock steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're going to confess," Jack said softly. "You're going to tell them everything, about Blake and Worth and Sam's murder, about the bank robbery, about framing me. You're going to give me back my life." "Go to hell," Daniels gasped. "You first." Jack cocked his gun. "Blackwood, you got a stenographer? Because Mr. Daniels here is about to make a full confession." It took 2 hours and the threat of bleeding out before Daniels broke. But break he did. With a federal stenographer recording every word and Blackwood as witness, Porter Daniels confessed to everything: the fraud scheme in Deadwood, Samuel Coulter's murder, the bank robbery in Silver Creek, framing Jack for the crime, and every subsequent robbery committed under Jack's name. He named his accomplices, described the methods, provided details that only someone directly involved could know. When it was done, when every word had been recorded and witnessed and signed, Blackwood turned to Jack with something that might have been respect in his cold eyes. That was quite a performance, Mr. Coulter. Most men would have just shot him and been done with it. Most men haven't spent 3 years being hunted for crimes they didn't commit, Jack replied. I needed the confession more than I needed the revenge. You'll have both, Blackwood promised. I'll submit this directly to the territorial governor along with all the evidence Sheriff Garrett gathered. With Daniel's confession and the witness statements, your conviction should be overturned within the month. He extended his hand. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Sorry the system failed you. Sorry you had to spend 3 years running from a noose you never deserved. Jack shook his hand and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Vindication. Not just freedom, but the restoration of his name, his honor, his right to exist in the world as someone other than a wanted criminal. Can I go home? He asked. You can go home, Blackwood confirmed. You're a free man, Jack Coulter. Try to stay out of trouble. Jack rode back to Copper Ridge through a landscape transformed by autumn, the aspens burning gold in the high country, the air crisp and clean and full of promise. He'd sent a telegram ahead, 3 simple words. Coming home. Wait. Margaret met him at the edge of her property, Daniel beside her, and Pete standing on the porch with tears streaming down his weathered face. She didn't say anything, just looked at him with those fierce, beautiful eyes, waiting. It's over, Jack said, dismounting. Daniel's confessed to everything. Blackwood says my conviction should be overturned within the month. I'm free, Margaret. Really, truly free. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she was in his arms, and he was holding her like she was the only real thing in a world of shadows. Daniel crashed into both of them, his small arms wrapping around their waists, and the 3 of them stood there in the autumn sunlight, a makeshift family forged in fire and tempered by hope. Does this mean you're staying? Daniel asked, his voice muffled against Jack's coat. If your mother will have me, Jack said, looking down at Margaret. I seem to recall proposing to her a few weeks ago. Don't suppose she's thought about her answer? I said yes then, Margaret replied, laughing through her tears. I'm saying yes now. Yes to all of it. Yes to everything. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when the first snow of winter was dusting the peaks, but the valley was still green and gold. Sheriff Wade Garrett performed the ceremony in front of Margaret's ranch house, with half of Copper Ridge in attendance, and Daniel serving as best man with a seriousness that made the adults want to laugh and cry at the same time. Sarah Chen stood as Margaret's witness, and John Henderson gave the bride away. And old Pete cried openly without shame. Even Marshal Blackwood made an appearance, riding in from Carson City with official papers that confirmed what everyone already knew. Jack Coulter's conviction had been overturned, his record expunged, his name cleared of all charges. You're a free man in every sense of the word, Blackwood said, handing Jack the papers. Use it wisely. I intend to, Jack replied, looking at Margaret in her simple white dress, at Daniel grinning so hard his face might split, at the ranch that had become home and the community that had become family. I intend to use every single day wisely from here on out. The vows were simple and heartfelt. Jack promised to love and honor Margaret, to be a father to Daniel, to work this land with integrity and care. Margaret promised to stand beside Jack through whatever trials life threw at them, to never stop fighting for what was right, to build a future together that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. When Wade pronounced them husband and wife, and Jack kissed his bride, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the valley. Someone started playing a fiddle, and someone else broke out a jug of whiskey, and before long the front yard had transformed into an impromptu celebration that would be talked about for years to come. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue, Jack and Margaret slipped away from the party, walking hand in hand to the crest of the hill that overlooked the ranch. From here, they could see everything: the house with its new porch beam, the barn with its repaired roof, the well that would never run dry, the fence that stood straight and true marking the boundaries of their land. You sent for a husband, Jack said softly, echoing the words from what felt like a lifetime ago. Guess I finally became one. You didn't come to save my land, Jack, Margaret replied, leaning into his warmth. You came to save me, and I think maybe I saved you too. No, Maybe about it, Jack said, wrapping his arms around her. You saved me the moment you stepped between me and Wade's gun. You saved me when you offered me work instead of judgment. You saved me when you loved me despite everything the world said I was. He kissed the top of her head, breathed in the scent of her hair. I was running toward death, Margaret. Running fast and hard with no idea how to stop. And you stood in my path like an angel with a shotgun and said, "Not today." You made me believe I could be something other than a wanted man. You made me believe in redemption. Below them, the party continued, music and laughter drifting up on the evening breeze. Daniel's voice rang out, young and clear and full of joy, calling for his mother and his new father to come back and dance. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent. But here in this valley, on this ranch, in this moment, two people who'd been broken by loss and hardened by struggle had found something neither had dared hope for, a second chance. We should go back, Margaret said, though she made no move to leave. They'll be looking for us. In a minute, Jack said, holding her tighter. Just give me one more minute to stand here and remember what it feels like to be free, to be loved, to be home. They stood together as the sun disappeared behind the ridge and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two hearts that had been running in opposite directions finally finding each other in the vast emptiness of the frontier. The widow who'd sent for salvation and the outlaw who'd brought redemption, both of them scarred and stronger for it, both of them ready to build something that would last. Behind them, the ranch waited. Their ranch now, bought with sweat and blood and stubborn, impossible hope. Ahead of them, the future stretched out uncertain and full of promise. Winter coming, but spring always waiting just beyond it. And between them, in the space where their hands joined and their hearts beat in rhythm, was love. The kind of love that doesn't come easy or gentle, but fights its way into being against all odds and all reason, fierce and true and utterly unbreakable. Jack Coulter had come to Copper Ridge to fulfill a dead man's promise, carrying nothing but grief and a price on his head. He was leaving that life behind and stepping into a new one, carrying instead a wife's love and a son's trust and a community's respect. The wanted posters might still exist somewhere, gathering dust in some marshal's office, but they described a ghost, a man who no longer existed. The man who stood on that hillside holding the woman he loved while their son called them home was someone new. Someone reborn not by running from the past, but by facing it head on. Someone who'd learned that redemption isn't granted, it's earned, one fence post at a time, one honest day's work at a time, one moment of choosing courage over fear. "All right," Margaret said finally, squeezing his hand. "Let's go dance with our son." They walked down the hill together, toward the light and the music and the laughter, toward the life they'd built from ruins and refusal to give up. The stars were coming out above them, endless and eternal, and somewhere in that vast darkness, a new story was being written, not of an outlaw and a widow, but of a husband and wife who'd found each other in the most unlikely of places and chosen, against all reason and all odds, to believe in second chances. The music swelled as they rejoined the celebration, Daniel grabbing Jack's hand and Margaret's and pulling them into the circle of dancers. And as they spun beneath the gathering stars, surrounded by friends and family and the sweet, impossible promise of tomorrow, Jack Coulter finally understood what James Thornton had meant in those final moments in that Cheyenne saloon. This was where he was supposed to stop running. This was home.